Three Americans killed by a strike by Iranian-backed militias, the latest attempt by Tehran to turn the world upside down. Hi, I'm Brian Lilley, political columnist for the Toronto Sun. You've probably heard over the last few days about three American soldiers killed during a drone strike on a U.S. military base in Jordan. It was an Iranian-backed militia group that carried out the attack. It's leading many to question what will happen next. How will the Americans respond? But it should also be shining a light on the fact that Iran is the linchpin in all of the problems facing the Middle East and much of the world at the moment. Iran is an exporter of terror, whether into Gaza with Hamas or Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and these Iranian-backed militias that are striking the Americans, all of it leading to death and instability. Well, joining me now to talk more about this is Avi Melamed. He is a former Israeli intelligence officer. He is the man behind Inside the Middle East, both the book and the website, and he joins me now. Avi, thanks for the time as always.
Brian, thank you for having me.
Let's talk about Iran and how this is the linchpin. Obviously, as you've been writing about recently, talking about that the United States in retaliating has to be careful that they don't do a direct strike on Iran because it was an Iranian proxy that killed the three Americans. So I understand that, but I think what a lot of people are missing is whether we're talking about Gaza, Hezbollah, the Houthis, various efforts to destabilize the region. The common denominator is Iran and the exportation of terror. I mean, this week, I don't know if you heard, there was even a report that the Iranian regime had hired two members of the Hells Angels in Canada to carry out an assassination. It didn't happen, but they hired them to carry out an assassination of Iranian defectors in the United States. Iran is the linchpin in all of this, and the regime in Tehran is a major exporter of instability, violence, and evil in the world.
Yes, that is correct. This regime that came to power in 1979 in Iran, what is known as the Islamic regime, Revolution, there are some interesting features that we have to understand about this regime. This regime has a very revolutionary outlook of the world, and it has a very apocalyptic outlook of mankind. It is inspired by some very strong emotional narratives. The strongest one, apparently, is the narrative that argued that the Shiites, which are a minority in Islam, about 12% or 13%, and the Shiite regime, the Mullah regime in Tehran, is Shiite. The narrative says that the Shiite has been deprived from the right to lead the Muslim world, and they accuse the Sunni Muslims, the majority of the Muslims, in allegedly stealing from them the crown of leadership. This is something that happened 1400 years ago, but it's very much existing in the mindset of the people in the Middle East. So when the Mullah regime came to power in Iran in 1979, motivated by those features that I just mentioned, it has been proactively advancing a very aggressive regional expansion policy under the name of exporting the Islamic Revolution. And in their view, their objective in the end of the day is to become the superpower in the Middle East, the leading superpower in the Middle East, because in their view, and it goes back to the issue of the revolutionary outlook and the apocalyptic outlook that characterizes that regime, because in their view, by positioning the Mullah regime of Tehran as the superpower of the Middle East, they are actually setting the stage for the next phase, which is going beyond the region, expanding the evolution beyond the region.
So, they do have designs well beyond the Middle East, but let's talk for a moment about what they're doing in the Middle East. Israel currently engaged in a war with Hamas in Gaza. That is an organization that was trained and financed for the October 7th attack by Iran. But as I told you earlier, when I was in Israel, went up to the northern border, looked into Lebanon, and the line of Hezbollah fighters just across that border, some 250,000 rockets aimed at Israel. Hezbollah has nothing to do with the Palestinian issue and everything to do with Iran, or am I reading it wrong?
Well, actually, as you accurately mentioned, Iran is the linchpin, and now we can understand this whole structure that you mentioned, part of it. You mentioned Hezbollah, which is Lebanese Shiite organization. You mentioned Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza Strip, who are Sunni Palestinian organizations. In order to advance its hegemonic vision, the Mullah regime, one of the things that it was very effectively doing was to position itself as allegedly the protectors of the Palestinians and the one that will liberate Palestine. The Mullah regime couldn't care less about the Palestinians. In fact, the Mullah regime despised the Palestinians because the Palestinians are Sunnis. The Mullah regime are Shiites. The Palestinians are Arabs in their ethnicity. The Mullah regime is Persian. But the Mullah regime understood that by positioning itself as allegedly the defender of the Palestinians and the one who liberate Palestine, it will very well resonate with the ears and hearts of many people across the Middle East, and particularly Arabs. And so by doing that, the Mullah regime was basically creating a network of proxies, armed proxies. You mentioned some of them. Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is the biggest proxy of the Iranian regime. Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza Strip, Iraqi Shiite militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen that are Shiite tribes backed by the Iranians. And the common denominator of all of those names that I mentioned is that they are all backed, financed, armed, trained by the Mullah regime. And they are all part of this, what we call the crescent or the axis of resistance. The word resistance, basically, in the contemporary Middle East is the code word for, among other things, for first, eliminating the state of Israel through the use of violence, and second, to end the Western presence in the Middle East because they totally reject the Western values. So the master of this whole orchestra, if you wish, is the Mullah regime in Tehran.
So we'll deal with Israel facing down all these groups in a moment, but how does the United States deal with being attacked by Iran's proxies, by people that Iran are funding? They can't let it go unanswered, but do they, what is a proportionate response to the Houthis killing or the Iranian-backed groups killing 3 American soldiers?
Yes, I mean, look, the Western policy generally, and particularly the United States, roughly speaking, particularly clearly in the last generation, with some exceptions, is kind of like very much doing almost everything possible to avoid using military might in order to achieve or protect strategic interests. And the Mullah regime identified it. We saw that in the context of previous administrations of the United States, both Democrats as well as Republicans. And the Mullah regime identified it, and it's playing this card very effectively, sort of speaking. Now, the issue, the challenge here is that you got a situation where the Mullah regime have an upper hand when it can use proxies. By using the proxies, the Mullah regime is immune from retaliation. And on the other hand, the Western powers are enormously hesitant, very much reluctant of using their military power to protect their interests. So it's almost kind of like an unfair situation.
Isn't showing might and power how you deliver a message in the Middle East? I mean, it seems to be how these groups show their power. I mean, they are all about showing that they are strong, showing might, ruthlessness. Wouldn't they view this as a weak response or lack of response by the United States to be weakness?
Definitely. Not only that, I mean, look, when you look at the position or the image of the United States across the Middle East in the last couple of decades, there is a very clear, I would say, erosion, downsize, if you want, of the image of the United States as a superpower. In course of time, where players in the region, both friends as well as rivalries of the United States, looked at the United States policy across the region, they came more and more to the conclusion that the United States, for whatever the reason is they started to question to what extent they can rely on the United States. I'm talking about the friends of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And the enemies of the United States basically says, well, it looks like the United States is a tiger made of a paper. And so there has been a very clear process of erosion of the United States image as a superpower. You know, we always say that the best weapon that a superpower can have in its possession is the weapon it doesn't have to use, meaning it's calling projection of power. It's very clear that the United States projection of power has been very significantly eroded in the last couple of decades. So right now, for example, you mentioned the specific point where 3 United States soldiers were killed by the Iranian proxies. And by the way, this is something that was inevitable because up until now, there has been some 200 attacks on United States presence across the Middle East. And, you know, it goes back in the end of the day to something which is kind of like what I call the common sense. If you don't deal with bully when it's little, you will have to deal with a bully when it's big. And to a large extent, I think it sums up the whole story.
Well, Israel is having to deal with this bully on the southern border. It is worried about having a two-front war if Hezbollah does attack. So far, they've been lobbing missiles into residential neighborhoods, mostly in areas where people have been evacuated. But they haven't launched a full-scale attack yet. And I know that is a real worry. How, given that all of this is backed and pushed by the regime in Tehran, how does the world eventually deal with Tehran? You know, the Biden administration got rid of sanctions, released billions of dollars. That was supposed to bring them closer. It hasn't helped. It seems to have just added more fuel to the fire, more guns to the battlefield.
Yes, unfortunately, I think that it's a very accurate observation. Look, here is the situation today. You got Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestine, 2 Iranian-backed proxies that are holding Israelis hostages. And by the way, they're holding also their own brothers and sisters, Gaza people, as hostages as well, using them as a human shield. You got Hezbollah in Lebanon that is holding the Israeli northern population hostages. As you mentioned, they had to evacuate. But Hezbollah is also holding the Lebanese hostages against their will. They don't want to be dragged into this war in the service of the Iranian, but Hezbollah doesn't really ask them. You got the Houthis in Yemen that are now holding the world economy hostage. Or if you wish, Iran holds the world economy hostage. So that gives you, I would say, quite clear answer to the question how the West or the world, the free world, deals with the Iranian regime threat. The answer is very poorly, and that's the bitter fruit of what we see today.
Well, sadly, they seem to be aligning with Russia and to a certain degree China, and all of that becomes worrisome for going forward. Avi, thank you very much for the time and the insight today.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Brian.
Let us know what you think. Drop a comment or suggestion down below. Make sure you share this on social media where you're able to, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.